we'll move
Thank
on to the next speaker, Sriram Balasubramanian ji. Sriram Balasubramanian ji is going to present on the, according to Viksit Bharat on Dharma, based economic frameworks, a historical and current perspective. Sriram Balasubramanian ji is an economist and best-selling author. He made a sensation recently through the publication of his book on Indian economy in ancient India. I'll read a brief introduction of him. Sriram Balasubramanian is a well-known former IMF economist and best-selling author. He has worked for several global organizations, including the International Monetary Fund in the past. His areas of expertise include global macroeconomics, socioeconomic trends in emerging markets, uh, chronic Indic Dharmic culture, the context of economics. He has written for several international publications such as Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and Vox EU, among others, as an independent columnist. And columnist has been an independent panelist on CNBC TV 18. Besides authoring the path-breaking Kautilyanomics for modern times, Bloomsbury, he has authored the bestseller Dharmanomics. There is a website link here, dharmanomics.srirambala.in, which was the only book to be recognized by the Honorable PM Narendra Modi ji in writing in 2024. There are two other books, Jamba, The Joint Family, shortlisted for the third annual IAAC Literary Festival, organized by the Indo-American Arts Council, and The Wizards, which has been featured in various publications, including The Hindu. He is an alumnus of Columbia University, New York. Over to you, Sriram Balasubramanian.
Namaste, sir. Thank you. Thanks so much for your kind introduction. Can I just share my PPT?
Yeah,
If you can. Yeah, thank you. Namaste to everyone. Thanks, Dr. Nagaraj Paturiji, for the kind introduction. I just want to thank Dr. Harikiran Vadlamani as well for providing me this opportunity. Indica and Indica Academy in its former avatar has been a very strong supporter of my work. And Harikiranji's work has also inspired me for many years. So it's almost coming back home to do another presentation. So thank you again for providing me this opportunity. So I'll quickly, briefly run through my presentation. If there are any questions, please feel free to, ask them as comments. The focus of my presentation would be the role of cultural norms and narratives, and the role of Dharma-based economic frameworks, and why it's relevant for Viksit Bharat. How do we anchor Dharma-based economic frameworks for Viksit Bharat? I think this is one of my crucial research points that I've been making for some time now, for almost about 8-9 years, focusing on the role of cultural norms and narratives and its impact on economic outcomes. So how do you align policy making to the Dharmic way of life? I think in the role of statecraft institutions and in the broader IKS ecosystem, I think an important question, at least in the context of economics and public policy, is that how does one align policy to the Dharmic way of life? Because I argue that much of a contemporary Indian economics and social behavior is highly linked to this Dharmic way of life, and it's been there for thousands of years. It runs in parallel to modern contemporary policy device by policymakers. And this is independent of any other construct. So it's almost like an autopilot, and on its own path. We look at a lot of the spiritual and social elements of it, but it plays a lot of the economic behavioral choices that we make as part of this dharmic way of life, plays a very important role in the economic sense. Um, so here I'll be talking about what is this dharmic way of life, why is it important to understand it from a policy sense, what are some of the research questions? I think most of us here in this August gathering are people who are involved in research. So I think it's important to anchor a lot of our research in academic setting, academic context. So what are some of the research questions? And what are some of the examples that we see today, and how do we take this forward as we pursue Viksit Bharat? So why is it important to understand it from a policy sense? I think this is a very, important question that people often ask, especially in the economic policy space. Um, it's important to understand this because, like I mentioned, cultural norms and narratives play a very important role in our economic choices. When I mean economic choices, as an individual, when we make consumer choices, that is one part of economic choices. So, for instance, if you or me goes and buys, say, a laptop, or we buy something else, we might choose a particular time that we want to buy this particular laptop. We might have a variety of other factors that we choose while making that purchase. So a lot of these discretionary spending in Bharat is linked highly to cultural norms and narratives. So, for instance, the number of UPI interactions or transactions, the highest number of UPI transactions for the last year was during the week of Diwali, which means much of the what we call discretionary spending, non-essential spending, is linked highly to cultural norms and narratives. And in Bharat's case, this is a throughout the year phenomenon, except for particular phases, say for instance the Chaturmasya period, or particular phases where religious festivals and cultural activities are fairly limited. Much of the throughout the entire year, the role of these cultural norms and discretionary spending is very, very high. Um, from a corporate standpoint, most top corporates in the country, for instance, are family-driven businesses, and they link their, the dharmic way of life to their direct and indirect business choices. So, for instance, Mukesh Ambani and Jensen Huang were interacting in a recent forum in Mumbai a couple of months back, whereas Mukesh Ambani tells Jensen Huang, where Jensen Huang is the founder of NVIDIA, who's a world-leading maker in chips for AI, that Mr. Ambani was telling him that he makes new business choices during the week of Diwali because that's his traditional upbringing, and that's when he decides to start new businesses, for instance. So even at the corporate level, most of business choices, especially in family-driven firms, are driven by their cultural context, their cultural narrative, and how that drives their choices. Similarly, in the informal sector forms even today about 80%, 85% of employment in the country. And most, if not all, of the informal sector works on things like cultural norms, such as trust, familial and community-driven connections, and all of this, which encompass the dharmic way of life. So it's imperative that a lot of these key economic structures are driven by cultural norms, that we need to study them from a policy sense. This is not particular to a Bharatiya phenomenon. I mean, it is very significant in Bharat because of its omnipresence. But researchers across the world have dealt with this. For instance, George Eichelroth, the Nobel Prize winner in 2000, early 2000s in economics, speaks about the role of identity economics, the role of these cultural norms and narratives, but from a US context. Even in a US context, where the role of cultural norms is present but not as omnipresent as Bharat. Eichelroth argues that, that it plays an important role even in the American context. Similarly, Avner Grief from Stanford, Gary Becker from University of Chicago have studied in detail about all these things. Chinese and Japanese policymakers try to understand the cultural norms and narratives as well, and drive policy making through it. And in China, for instance, a lot of their economic policy making is highly decentralized, though it's a communist state. And it's at the local level, it's highly customized to local cultural norms and needs. Similarly, in Japan, you see the same trend. For instance, in Japan, it's impossible to go to Japan and live there without understanding Japanese. And everything is through the linguistic and cultural norms. Similarly for economic policy. Yet in Bharat, despite its centrality to our socioeconomic decisions, we don't dwell too much into it. The question is why? And this is an important question for us to ponder and explore. So in that context, I have two basic research questions which I deal with in my works, in my books, Dharmanomics, Kautilyanomics, and my subsequent work as well. Is what is the indigenous economic model that Bharat has had through its history? Why is it relevant today? And what is the role of cultural norms and narratives in economic decision making at the individual level, at the corporate level, and as an extension at the macro policy level? So these are the two key research questions that I try to deal with. Of course, this is a chart that is often cited nowadays. Angus Madison's World Economy and Millennial Perspective. Basically, Angus Madison was a late economic historian who had worked on world economic history for about 1,000 years, from zero C onwards till about the 19th century, where he talks between 0 and 1700 AD, that the CE period. He talks about India and China being the two biggest countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita during this period. So, for instance, if we look at the orange bar and the gray bar, the orange bar represents China and the gray bar represents India, Bharat. And you'd see that both of them are almost near each other till about 17th century, growing together as the top two countries in the world. Of course, Madison's data itself, in my view, is underplaying some of India's prosperity. In fact, I have another paper which is trying to assess this from a different sense. But leaving that sort of academic debate as it may, I think the trend line is very important to understand. It basically tells us, broadly speaking, from a quantitative lens, that Bharat and China are the top two countries in the world in terms of economic might, from zero CE onwards, or much before as well. I mean, the data is from zero CE. So the question really is, how did this happen? Did this happen through some random, act of construct by God, or it happened because there's systemic thinking, a systemic economic philosophy behind this, which laid the framework? And this led me to Kautilya's Arthashastra, where I spent a few years understanding the Arthashastra and devising this idea called dharmic capitalism. Dharma is a very complex word, at least for a erudite audience such as this. I think you can write multiple books on the definition of dharma itself, but purely for a simplistic sort of an audience, for a policy audience, I define it through the prism of ethics, harmony, and responsibilities as components of dharma. And I map it to outcomes related to dharmic capitalism, which is basically clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, and driver of economic growth and wealth creation. Similarly, under the harmony bucket, I talk about a global outlook, social welfare and well-being, and responsibilities in terms of familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities. So all of these outcomes are mapped into three major pillars of dharmic capitalism, which is a rule-based yet non-intrusive state. So basically a state that has a certain section of strict rules, which means, say, for instance, I am trading with Dr. Paturiji, two types of products in Kautilya's period. Kautilya's state would give us certain firm rules on how this trade needs to be done, but it wouldn't micromanage on the quantity or the quality or the type of products that we use in trading a particular product. So that is what a rule-based yet non-intrusive state is, for instance. And then wealth creation via global outlook. So this concept that somehow Bharat became engaged with the rest of the world post 1990 liberalization reforms, and before that we were sort of closeted and not engaging with the world, is probably the biggest, one of the top historical fallacies that we have been fed with. Uh, you know, we have been engaging, trading, not just products with the rest of the world, but ideas for thousands of years. The only period I would say is the post-independent India period, from the 1940s till about 1990s, that we were closed, sort of a closed economy. But other than that, especially in the early CE period, there's continuous global trade. In fact, the Roman current account deficit was highly linked to trade that was coming from Bharat. So much so that, in the early CE period, the second biggest depositor of Roman coins, which is an important barter for trade, sort of a currency for trade, the second biggest discovery after Europe was made in southern Bharat. So much was the influence of that it was able to influence even the economic fundamentals of the Roman Empire, because so much was traded from Bharat and the rest of the world. So wealth creation via global outlook and sustainable growth and welfare. So much of modern, again, thought is viewed through the prism of rights. I argue that Kautilya's perspective is through the prism of responsibilities. The notion of responsibilities from the state, from the society, from the family, and from the environmental responsibilities. And sustainable growth and welfare is another bucket. So these three pillars of dharmic capitalism is what I characterize Kautilya's Arthashastra by. And my book deals with the various chapters which applies it to the Indian economy in terms of trade, inequality, and things like that. So this is for the early sort of 3rd century BCE period. Subsequently, I move on to Dharmanomics, which is my next book, which Dr. Paturiji spoke about, where I deal with common era kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Pandyas, Vijayanagara Empire, the Southeast Asian kingdoms in Cambodia, Vietnam, Java, and these places. And I argue that there's an extension of this Dharma-based economic frameworks into these kingdoms as well. They make up three major pillars. One is the Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, which we just spoke about, rule enforcing a non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, sustainable growth and welfare. The Dharmic ecosystem, which becomes a very important component in the early CE period, where the temple-based economies get more and more traction. In fact, in Cambodia, in around 6th to 7th century CE, the idea of temple-based economies was actually foundational to their economic prosperity. So much so that, between 6th to 7th century CE till about 13th century CE, that was their model. Because in Cambodia's case, unlike in Bharat, they didn't have a thriving port. There is a sea only to the south of Cambodia, and the rest of the nation is landlocked. So they were dependent highly on temple-based economic models, which means the temple was not just the central social institution, but is a central economic institution. Because of the temple, it creates economies of scale all around the village area, and all the economic activity were happening around the temple. And that served as an important anchor. And then I talk about decentralized economic systems, the role of how do you create decentralized economic systems through the Dharmic ecosystem. And also, we talk a lot about sustainability. How do you devise sustainable solutions, and how did people in the past devise sustainable solutions? Those are discussed in some of my work. And then Srini Dharma, the role of Srenis, the corporate guilds, and how many of these corporate guilds were drivers of global maritime trade. They were akin to our modern day multinational corporations across the world that we see today. For instance, there's a guild called Ainurvar in Tamil Nadu, which was the sort of main Sreni, which financed the Cholas. One of the reasons why Rajendra Chola, the son of Rajaraja Chola built the Brihadishwara temple, the imperious Brihadishwara temple, and Rajendra Chola built the Gangaikonda Chola, which the Honorable Prime Minister visited recently. And he was one of the kings who traveled across Southeast Asia and won over battles. But he did not rule Southeast Asia. One of the reasons is that the guild Ainurvar, which is a major Sreni, was traveling through the Straits of Malacca and trading between Bharat and China. Used to travel via the Straits of Malacca and then up towards China. And the Srivijaya kingdom, which is a maritime trade kingdom, a maritime kingdom in which is in today's Indonesia, tried to block the trade which Ainur was doing. So that's why Rajendra Chola had to step in, and he combined with the Cambodian kings and overthrew this Indonesian Srivijaya kingdom and allowed the trade and commerce to go through. So that's one of the reasons why he went there, won the battle, but did not necessarily rule these places, because one of the main purposes was to enable trade and commerce. Such was the impact of trade and commerce and the role of Srenis during that time. So I spoke about temple-based economies. So in very simple terms, the temple-based economies, even today, more so in the earlier period, used to have four major roles. One, they were labor aggregators, which means people associated with the temple and its land, and were providing employment to large sections of people: artisans, laborers, construction workers. They were providing employment to librarians, all the other shops, kirana shops that you see, around the temple. They were providing employment to a lot of these people. So at the village level, it was a major labor aggregator. Second, temples served as banks and financial institutions. One of the reasons why you see that, the major temples in Bharat, whether it is Somnath in Gujarat, Padmanabha Swami temple in Kerala, or even the Brihadishwara temple itself, and then say Jagannath Puri, a lot of these major temples are within an hour's drive from the coast. There's a reason for this, because most of the temples served as sort of financial lending institutions. They were financing a lot of, or providing lending to a lot of Srenis, corporate guilds, which you mentioned, and also a lot of the local entrepreneurs at reasonable rates, because of the fact that the temple itself was fairly wealthy, and its economics around it as an institution was very wealthy. It was able to finance and provide financing to a lot of these traders, and that enabled global trade and commerce. In fact, the temple ecosystem was a major enabler in terms of financing a lot of these trading communities, and also providing venture capital to local entrepreneurs. We talk a lot about venture capital nowadays. In fact, the temple ecosystem and the Dharmic ecosystem was a major driver of venture capital for local entrepreneurs. So, for instance, if you're in a town like Sringeri, even today, the entire town of Sringeri is based on the Sharadamba temple and the visitors who come into Sharadamba temple, for instance. They might come in for tourism, they might come in for, because of the religious purposes, they invest and spend their money on a variety of things, in terms of hospitality, in terms of the local shopping that they do, in terms of staying over in these places. So a lot of them drive economies of scale. And similarly, providing venture capital to these local entrepreneurs who are part of this ecosystem was an important avenue for the temples before itself. And lastly, they were major redistributive agents. So what is this in simple terms? They try to reduce inequality in society. So for instance, in the Tirumala plates, we go to Tirupati, Tirumala Tirupati temple quite often, and we're all aware of the majestic Lord Venkateshwara temple there. But the Tirumala plates give us a very good perspective of some of these issues. So in the early CE period, the Vijayanagar kings institutionalized this redistribution strategy, in the sense that they used to have an endowment where a lot of wealthy people in a particular area would put in money, and that would serve as the financing for running a particular temple. First the rituals and the anushthanas required for the temple are taken care, and subsequently the financing of the temple and its activities are also done by this endowment. And what happens in the temple is anyone can walk into the temple, rich or poor, and get 3 days of food or prasadam free of cost, which meant that if you're someone below the poverty line, you just walk into a temple, you get 3 times a day food, and your basic levels are taken care. So in that sense, anyone who's poor below a poverty line was provided the basic needs and resources required through this mechanism. And the idea really is the money in when you really look at a concept flow, it flows from the rich of a particular community through the endowment with the temple as a major vehicle, and then food and supplies are provided to people below poverty line so that they reach sustenance levels. So the gap between the rich and poor in that sense is getting reduced because of this mechanism which has been enabled. So that not only is it providing them basic subsistence, this also ensures that they can move higher up in the ladder rather than focusing on basic needs which are taken care by this mechanism. So this is another example of how the dharmic ecosystem served as redistributive agents. You spoke about the Srenis. I think for people who are interested, you should read this paper by Professor Vikramaditya Khanna, who's at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He has written a complete paper on Srenis. In fact, he's one of my collaborators. In his paper, he talks about how the Sreni is compared to the modern day corporation. So this is a table that signifies that. A lot of the characteristics of the modern day corporation in terms of a separate entity, centralized management, ability to democratically elect leaders, having a stakeholder meeting, board and committee independence, voting regulations, a lot of similarities between what a modern corporation is and what a Sreni was. So to that effect, a modern multinational corporation and its governance structure is actually an inspiration from Sreni rather than the other way around. So this is an important point. Avoiding the idea of Matsya Nyaya. This is a very, again, important theme that you see in the Arthashastra, where Kautilya argues that in the absence of law and order, enforcement of punishment, strong will swallow the weak. The big fish will eat all the small fish. And to avoid that, he says, you need to ensure rule of law and order is implemented significantly and to the T. And that will reduce this propensity for Matsya Nyaya. Similarly, the view of inequality is also viewed through this prism. So Kautilya also talks about reducing the gap between the rich and the poor and enabling the poor with a variety of mechanisms to empower them and provide them basic subsistence, but beyond that, empower them so that they can grow in society. So this is an important theme again from the past, which could be applied to today's Indian economic principles. Rule of law and enforcement of contracts. We talk a lot about the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of today, which is basically a platform which is created by this government to provide support to bankrupt firms. So, for instance, if there's an entrepreneur who goes and invests in a particular idea, but somehow has had a failure, this IBC provides a platform to restructure the debt and revive the company and the employers. This is a sort of a mainstream concept in the West, but in India, it's been there for the last decade. But guess what? This was there even thousands of years back during Kautilya's time, and also even in the early Common Era period, where the rule of law and enforcement of contracts was very important. The role of kingship, though there was a monarch, the king was sort of a guardian of resources more than owning a lot of resources. A lot of resources were also owned by private entities, and the public had ownership of resources, but particular to the king. The king served as more of a guardian of a lot of these processes and resources. Property laws and enforcement was again another important feature. we see a lot of emphasis on property laws and enforcement in our ancient text, and also labor contracts and enforcement. In fact, to the point that Kautilya himself argues that for a laborer, for a common laborer, he says that employers should provide a template for a contract, even for a daily wage laborer. So, for instance, if you walk into any construction site today in Chennai or Bengaluru or Delhi or any Indian city, and randomly ask a daily wage laborer if he or she has a contract for their employment, the answer would be mostly no. That they are just given daily wages and there is no contract per se. Kautilya had argued that employers should provide some level of basic, structure to the daily wage laborer in terms of what they need to do, what is their understanding of their job, and what are some of the rights and responsibilities that they have. And this had to be sort of put as a template outside their activity side, so that people know that these daily wage laborers are not taken for granted, and it empowers them to have a contract in their hand, and enable the contracts in their hand. So labor contracts and enforcement again was a very important feature of the Dharma-based economic frameworks, and that's again an important highlight that one needs to see. So, what are some of the contemporary examples from the present? I think what I call Dharmanomics in action. This is again an important question. The Mahakumbh Mela is a very good example. I mean, I think many people would have visited the Mahakumbh. I was fortunate enough to visit the Mahakumbh this year. Of course, it was an adventurous trip, but I thoroughly was overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of humanity at the Mahakumbh. But if you really look at the Mahakumbh, this is a very important example of what I call Dharmanomics in action, right? 100 years back, 200 years back, when Bharat was not even a nation state, you still get 400, 500 million people at the Mahakumbh. So irrespective of other factors, you're having millions of people coming not to a temple per se, but a facet of Dharmanomics, a dharmic activity. And they're coming there to, in this case, to do Ganga Snan and then visit the place. And then, as a consequence, move to other places in the particular area, spend some time there, which means spend some time on money, on tourism, on infrastructure, on other tourist places in, say, Uttar Pradesh area, or also on spending time on other investments and activities in that particular area. And this is independent of any sort of, even the concept of nation state is something very new compared to, say, the Mahakumbh. So this is what I define as the natural way of life that has been happening. The Mahakumbh is sort of a big, once in a long time example. But there are a lot of these micro events that happen across Bharat through the year, which define much of our discretionary spending. So there are four main pillars that you see. One is decentralized economic boom with what I call highly inelastic demand. Again, a technical term, but let me try to simplify it. So for instance, when we go to the Mahakumbh, we don't really look at what the Reserve Bank of India's interest rate is today or what your lending rate is today. Okay, if the RBI's interest rate is, say, about 6-7%, compared to, say, it is 2-3%, you might reduce your expenditure by probably a few percentage points. But the journey of going to the Mahakumbh will happen irrespective of what the macroeconomic environment is. So in that sense, this is a hugely inelastic demand, which means it does not change. The demand it does not change because of other external factors. So this makes it very unique because it provides an opportunity to uplift the economy, given so many people of being involved, even when there's a downturn, for instance. The second thing is direct economies of scale. So, for instance, in the current Mahakumbh, the estimated revenue from the entire Mahakumbh was about 2.5 lakh crores. I think, in fact, the final numbers are more than this, but the direct estimates based on the revenues associated just surrounding the Mahakumbh is about 2.5 lakh crores. The GDP of Uttar Pradesh for the year 2023-2024 was 25.8 lakh crores, which means the Mahakumbh almost contributed, in fact, in the lower estimate, between 5 to 10% of GDP for that calendar year. Uh, Such is the impact of direct economies of scale, which means, you know, directly purely because of the event and because of its scale and grandeur, you're getting this much revenue. And then there are a lot of indirect economies of scale. What do you mean by indirect economies of scale? Which basically, the infrastructure that's developed for the Mahakumbh, for instance, the tents, the support infrastructure, the roads that have been built, the clusters of economic activity that have been created. All these are all indirect economies of scale, which stay there even after the Mahakumbh. I mean, the roads don't disappear after the Mahakumbh. So the transportation facilities don't disappear, which have been developed, and also other forms of economic activities. So these are investments that are made for the long term, which are indirect economies of scale that are created, which has a medium and long term value as well. And then time bound policy response for greater policy effectiveness. In a setting such as Bharat, which is in democratic Bharat, the role of bureaucracy and its institutions play a very important role in implementing policy. And this is a practical constraint, whether we like it or not. But what such events bring up is it provides a very targeted outcome for the bureaucracy and makes it more efficient. So, for instance, the entire world is thinking about both the prime minister as well as the machinery, and the world is thinking about the Mahakumbh. So the bureaucracy is sort of forced to act and bring efficient outcomes, so that their reputation and is maintained, and there is a sort of a push to do this within a short period of time rather than prolong it for a long period of time. So that way it creates more efficiency, more constraints, but also enhances efficiency in public policy. So these are some instances of examples of within the Mahakumbh how Dharmanomics is in action in my view. Similarly, Swachh Bharat is another example of a successful scheme, especially in rural areas. So, for instance, there's a lot of evidence that comes out, and both anecdotally and otherwise, that Swachh Bharat is far more successful in rural areas than in urban areas. And this, in my view, is a perfect alignment of policy with the way of life. We are all clean in our houses. Saucham, which is a definition of Dharma, of cleanliness, is a very inbuilt quality where we try to be as clean as possible within our houses. But in our neighborhoods, this did not translate for some time. So through the Honorable Prime Minister and the entire Swachh Bharat scheme, it creates this huge scheme and machinery because of the Prime Minister's vision and state, and translates this dharmic consciousness called Saucham from ourself to the neighborhood outside. So much so that when you go to many villages, even in Tamil Nadu, where I come from, a lot of the streets, main street, except for the main street, most of the streets are very clean. There is evidence to suggest that much of this is because people see now this as their dharmic responsibility to take care of the neighborhood as well, not just their own houses. This sort of is an example of how a major public policy, through the machinery of a very popular prime minister and the state, is able to align policy making to this way of life, attributing to Saucham and expanding this to their neighborhood, creating this dharmic sense of responsibility, and creating a very successful outcomes in terms of cleanliness, sanitation, and things like that. So much so that now, villages viewed as their dharmic responsibility to be clean, to have sanitation. So irrespective of the state, you're having policy aligned to this successful way of life and getting sustainable and much more effective outcome. So this is a very good example, of the present that you see. Similarly, the RBI's sovereign gold scheme. The UP government had this one product, one village, which means for every village, they look at a product which is very customized to that village, where they have expertise. and they develop their product. So for instance, you'd have heard about the Kolhapur chapels, for instance, or the diamonds that are made in, say, in Surat. So each district in Bharat, not just in UP but across Bharat, has particular customized tendencies, customized economic products that they make, and an attempt is being made to expand these economies of scale, which is again aligned to this way of life. So the smart cities plan is also another example. I've often argued that our cities have reached their inflection points, and we need to build decentralized economies of scale, build up tier two, tier three towns into bigger urban clusters, and then make our urban cities more efficient, not expand them unless relentlessly. Um, and if we are able to develop tier two, tier three towns into bigger towns, I think Dharma-based economic frameworks is a very important anchor because it provides sustainable economic financing, it provides highly inelastic demand, it provides an ecosystem which is aligned to this natural way of life, and it is able to lift the informal sector into not just formality but into bigger economies of scale and clusters. And we have a lot of support infrastructure already. I mean, there's a flight that goes from Delhi to Trichy for 3-4 times a day, from where you can go to any place within an hour's drive in the Tanjore belt, for instance. So, and there is digital 4G, 5G in most of the villages, at least 3G. So, a lot of the support infrastructure is there. It's a question of developing these economies of scale, and it's imperative that, in my view, that Dharma-based economic frameworks need to be an anchor, important anchor for decentralized economies of scale. So, lastly, what is the way forward? In this context, I think conscious alignment of policy making towards the dharmic way of life and processes could lead to much more efficient policy outcomes, which means policymakers and thinkers need to consciously look at how do you align dharmic way of life, how to quantify it, how to create analysis out of it, and then use it for policy outcomes. So, some of my papers and research, papers and journal publications try to push this research in that area, so that we create systems which represents this in the public policy space, cognizant of local customized needs, and building economies of scale around it. The idea of Atmanirbharta, in terms of building resilience and expanding these local economies of scale, driving decentralized economic models through the dharmic ecosystem to expand economies of scale of tier 2, tier 3 cities, and greater need for customized local solutions through this lens, while incorporating global ideas and best practices, ensuring that we get the best from the world, but also having a distinct identity. And lastly, the entire sort of um, temple debate has often sort of veered towards state versus private entities, governing the temples, which is, of course, a rightful cause, and something that I think all of us would want the temples away from the state. But I think while that is become a political issue, there's a lot of case for looking at the ecosystem around the temple, which drives a lot of economic activity, and having economic activity anchored towards these ecosystems, and then expanding them significantly. So that, I think, is there for the taking right away, and it's important that policymakers look at this. So this was my sort of broad overview of Dharma-based economic frameworks, and why I believe that if you're going to be Viksit Bharat, we have to address and expand the anchor it on
ఇక్కడ
this
ఆరు
Dharma-based economic frameworks,
కూర్చుందామా అక్కడ కూడా
and
పడుకోండి
that will result in
మళ్ళీ
more
పక్కన
sustainable, and help us to grow towards a developed country in a much more sustainable, indigenous way, which can last for another 1,000 years. Thank you, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I will be glad to address any questions if need be. Thanks.
even the budget is highly dependent on agriculture, cultural, and dharmic norms mainly, is the question from Pankaj Sahai ji. Uh, it's a question at the end of the sentence. So probably we can convert that into a question. Is the budget highly dependent on agriculture, cultural, and dharmic norms mainly? Why isn't government of India freeing temples and letting Hindu money and economics do what it can? That's a question to government of India. But the first question is the budget is highly dependent on agriculture, cultural, and dharmic norms mainly.
No, see, agriculture is still an important part of the broader economic um, uh, system in Bharat. It still provides significant number of people, employment for significant number of people. Whether that's right or not is a different story. So agriculture plays an important role even today, in terms of purely employment, in, term, in terms of labor, in terms of its contribution towards the economy. Um, the idea of these cultural norms and narratives is not in a particular sector. Like what I mentioned, it has an impact across sectors because it deals with a lot of the consumer choices that we make. How do we make business choices at the individual level? How do we make at the corporate level? So, for instance, if say the TVS group wants to invest in a particular factory in a particular region, what are some of the factors that they would take into account? If it's a completely Western firm, it might just take rational factors, not economic, purely on economic factors in account. Whereas, Bharati businesses would look at a much more holistic, much more multidimensional approach to making these economic choices. And what is the source of this multidimensional approach? It is the cultural way of life. It is cultural norms and narratives of their upbringing, their familial, norms and narratives, and their societal norms and narratives. So those determine choice. So similarly, at the policy level, we mentioned about Swachh Bharat and things like that. So you see that, also at the policy level. So this is sort of a horizontal, cultural norms and narratives sort of horizontal across various sectors in terms of the economic space. And that, has an impact across board. And that impact is seen, for observers in an anecdotal way. What I try to do with some of my co-authors and researchers is to quantify this in a much more academic manner, and then create structures which can help us get a much more analytical perspective of these things. And on the second question related to why the government is not doing this, I think, like what Dr. Paturi said, it's probably for the government to know. And I think there are a variety of factors at play, but eventually one hopes that, temples are away from governmental control. Yeah, I think there's a hand from.
Yeah, Sriram, it's a very informative talk. I had two questions actually. One is in terms of GDP in a dharmic society, you can expect a net very high GDP. Has been the case all the while, but may not exactly be the per capita GDP, right? Because only one of the four ashramas pursues wealth generation and all that. So what would be good metrics to measure the health of a good dharmic economy, according to you? And the second one is, how would you trade off the formal and the informal components? Let's say Kumbh and all those. A lot of those are informally generated economies, right? So where does the trade-off lie between them?
Yeah. Thanks. Very good questions. So the first one is on
A good metric
GDP.
for yeah.
Yeah, GDP and GDP per capita, right?
Yes.
So see, the ashramas play a role. I mean, they played a role in the past And my sense is, see, I don't approach, I feel that current economic systems, I mean, the way the Dharma-based economic frameworks function is that it can serve as a very good add-on to the current economic systems that we have. Wholesale changes to the current economic system at one shot, for instance, is, in my view, not a practical perspective. There's already an intrinsic dharmic component to whatever that we do. Fleshing them out, creating structures around them, creating metrics and mechanisms that you talk about to define them, and then using them on a say case-to-case basis, for instance, in the case of Swachh Bharat as an example, where you can implement it for individual policies. And then over a period of time, this will aggregate and mainstream itself to be an integral part of the overall policy ecosystem. So that's sort of an organic, upscaling is what I would suggest. But in terms of purely the impact of GDP and GDP per capita, it's I wouldn't say that just because it's a dharmic economy, the per capita incomes will be lesser, because in a modern context, the ashrama theory might not be as reflective, because you have multiple stakeholders who are contributing to the economy per se. But see, this, I think the overall sort of metric should be prosperity, right? Prosperity is the broad metric, because GDP is one part of it that reflects prosperity. But as long as prosperity is sustainable, is inclusive, and is all encompassing, then I think that's a goal which would, which any like-minded person would want to pursue. On the second question, between the trade-off, I think that's a very important point. And that's where, the Bharatiya, society it plays a very distinct role between informal and formal. The difference is actually minimal if you really think about it, right? Because when I talk about, say, formal institutions, I spoke about corporates. Some of the top biggest corporates in India today, if you take the top 15, 20 corporates, most of them are family-driven businesses, even in the second generation, third generation. And most of these corporates who are formal institutions, who are, having all the formal mechanisms that we talk about, formal instruments and institutions, they make their business choices based on their cultural framework. So the difference between, the difference between a Kirana shop owner and a Mukesh Ambani in terms of making a business choice, if you really think about it, the differences are much, much lesser compared to any other society, in terms of formal and informal. Okay, scale might vary, opportunities might vary, the overall architecture might vary, factors of decision making might vary. Mukesh Ambani might have a much more complex matrix, but the same individuals might not, for instance, start off their new project during Rahu Kala, for example, or they might not start off their project during a particular time of the year, or they might start their project, say, during Diwali, or during some time of the year where they find comfortable, aligned to their cultural norms and narratives. So what I'm saying is there is a trade-off between formal and informal, and I think, while it's important that a lot of the informal sector firms grow and become bigger firms, but whether all of them need to be formal is a different story. Because again, definition of formality can vary significantly across countries. So for instance, a lot of informal firms today are highly digital. They are highly part of the digital ecosystem. Given GST and things like that, they're also part of the taxation network. So informal to formal is one part of the story, but even within the trade-off between this, the differences in terms of their choices, consumer choices that they make at the business level and business choices, is still, I would say, they have a lot of commonalities as well. anything. But this is an important trade-off to understand, because as we proceed towards Viksit Bharat, what do we do the major chunk of the informal sector, and how do they transition either to the formal sector or in a much more efficient informal sector mode is a very important question. In my view, if we don't understand this dharmic way of life and this dharma-based economic frameworks, which drive a lot of informal sector activity, it's very difficult to anchor our Viksit Bharat drive, in my view. Yeah, so hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sriram Balasubramanian ji. The talk speaks volumes about your long and deep experience in the field of economics. And there are many such people with such deep and long experience in the field. But India is fortunate to have people like you who have a grounding in dharmic understanding and being able to think creatively from dharmic perspective and connecting it to our texts like Kautilya's Arthashastra. So the whole talk was definitely, I would think that for all the audience, it was a revealing one. When uploaded onto our YouTube channel, it will be available for the general public also. It will be very, very enlightening to the audience, I strongly believe. Thank you very much for giving us such a deep and intricate and nuanced analysis. Thank you very much.